What if the book of Revelation was not written by John of Patmos alone, but was based on a much older text that Mary Magdalene had preserved? A prophecy that she had received directly from the feminine aspect of the divine that Christianity would later suppress? And what if the bizarre imagery of beasts and seals and trumpets was actually a coded message designed to hide in plain sight, a teaching so dangerous to patriarchal power structures that it had to be encrypted in symbols that only those with the proper keys could decipher? In the catacombs beneath Rome, in chambers that tourists never visit and that even most Vatican scholars do not know exist, there rests a collection of manuscripts that were sealed away during the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, when the bishops gathered to determine which texts would be canonical and which would be declared heretical. And among these forbidden writings is a gospel attributed to Mary Magdalene that bears the title, The Apocalypse of the Beloved. And it claims to be the source text from which the canonical book of Revelation was adapted, stripped of its original meaning, and transformed into something that could serve the emerging orthodoxy rather than threaten it. In the winter of 2020, a biblical scholar named Dr. Catherine Morrison was granted rare access to the restricted Vatican archives as part of her research into early Christian women's writings. And among the hundreds of fragmentary texts she examined, she discovered a complete codex that should not have existed according to everything she knew about the suppression of Gnostic and feminine-centered Christianity. The manuscript was in remarkably good condition, written in Coptic with marginal notes in Greek and Aramaic, and it bore a colophon that identified it as a copy made in the 4th century from an original that dated to the 1st century. Written by Mary, called Magdalene, in the year following the crucifixion. Catherine opened the codex with trembling hands, understanding that if this text was authentic, it represented evidence of a tradition that the Church had spent nearly 2,000 years trying to erase. Proof that Mary Magdalene had not been merely a reformed prostitute or even just a devoted follower, but had been a teacher in her own right, a prophet who had received direct revelation and who had transmitted teachings that the male disciples either did not receive or chose not to preserve. The text began with words that immediately signaled this was not a conventional gospel. I, Miriam of Magdala, whom some call the Beloved and whom others will call the Harlot, write this testimony for those who will come after, when the world stands at the threshold between one age and another, when the structures built on domination begin to collapse, and the possibility emerges for a new covenant based on sacred partnership rather than hierarchical control. What I record here is the vision I received 3 nights after the Master ascended, when I went alone to the cave where his body had rested, and I entered into the deepest meditation I had ever achieved. And in that state I encountered not the Master himself, but the Divine Mother, the feminine face of God that our tradition has worshipped in secret, while publicly declaring allegiance to the Father alone. Catherine read through the night, her academic training warring with the part of her that recognized something profoundly important in what she was reading. Mary described a vision that paralleled the book of Revelation in many details, but that interpreted those details in completely different ways. Where John's apocalypse spoke of God's wrath and final judgment, Mary spoke of transformation and rebirth. Where John's warned of beasts and demons that would arise to torment humanity, Mary's described the awakening of suppressed aspects of consciousness that would seem monstrous only to those who had been taught to fear the feminine, the earthly, the embodied. The Divine Mother showed me, Mary wrote, that what the world calls the end times is not the end, but a passage, not destruction, but metamorphosis, not the punishment of a wrathful God, but the labor pains of a cosmos giving birth to a new form of consciousness. She showed me that the symbols that would be recorded in the canonical apocalypse were not literal predictions, but archetypal patterns, maps of the collective transformation that humanity would need to undergo when the age of patriarchal dominion reached its inevitable conclusion, and the suppressed feminine consciousness began to reassert itself. Mary explained that she had shared this vision with the male disciples, but they had not been able to receive it fully because their consciousness was still shaped by the patriarchal assumptions of their culture. They heard her words, but interpreted them through the lens of masculine apocalyptic thinking, transforming her message of transformation into a message of judgment. Her teaching about the return of the feminine into a warning about the dangers of the beast and the whore. And when John later wrote his revelation on Patmos, he drew on Mary's vision but filtered it through his own understanding, creating a text that preserved the structure and many of the symbols but reversed the meaning. "The woman clothed with the sun," Mary wrote, "whom John describes as giving birth to a child who will rule the nations. This is the divine feminine herself, the Sophia who has been exiled from heaven by the patriarchal God, but who returns in the final age to reclaim her rightful place as co-creator and equal partner with the masculine divine. The dragon who threatens her is not Satan, but the patriarchal structures that have suppressed feminine power, and the war in heaven is not between good and evil, but between the old consciousness of domination and the emerging consciousness of sacred partnership." Catherine found detailed explanations of symbols that had puzzled biblical scholars for centuries. The 7 seals that had to be opened were not literal seals on a scroll, but 7 levels of initiation into the feminine mysteries, 7 stages of consciousness development that would allow humanity to integrate what had been suppressed. The 4 horsemen were not harbingers of doom, but representations of the forces that would dismantle the old order. The white horse was truth that could no longer be hidden. The red horse was the righteous anger of the oppressed. The black horse was the economic collapse that would come when exploitation could no longer be sustained. And the pale horse was the death of the patriarchal ego that had declared itself God. "The beast whose number is 666, Mary explained in a passage that made Catherine gasp, is not a person or even a specific institution, but a principle. The principle of patriarchal domination itself, which is always incomplete, always falling short of the divine perfection that is 777, always marked by the incompleteness that comes from suppressing half of the divine nature. And the mark of the beast is not a physical brand, but a consciousness. The consciousness that accepts hierarchy and domination as natural and inevitable, that cannot imagine partnership or equality, that worships power over and rejects power with. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Mary described the final vision that the Divine Mother had shown her, the New Jerusalem that would descend from heaven, not as a physical city, but as a new form of consciousness, a way of being that honored both masculine and feminine, both transcendence and immanence, both spirit and matter. "The city has 12 gates," Mary wrote, 6 for the sons of Israel and 6 for the daughters, equal access, equal authority, the ending of the separation that has caused so much suffering. And the tree of life grows in the center of the city, no longer forbidden as it was in Eden, but freely accessible to all, because the new consciousness understands that knowledge is not dangerous but essential, that eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil was not the fall but the rising, not the sin, but the necessary step in the evolution of consciousness from innocence to wisdom. Catherine spent 3 months studying the manuscript, comparing it with the canonical revelation and with other Gnostic texts that had been discovered at Nag Hammadi and elsewhere. And the more she studied, the more convinced she became that Mary's Apocalypse was indeed the source text, that it predated John's version, and that John had adapted it, whether consciously or unconsciously, to fit the emerging Orthodox narrative. The parallels were too exact to be coincidence, but the interpretations were opposite, as though someone had taken a teaching about liberation and transformation and inverted it into a teaching about judgment and submission. But the most controversial section of Mary's Apocalypse was the final chapter, where she recorded a prophecy that the Divine Mother had given her about when and how the hidden teaching would be revealed. When the age of Pisces is ending and the age of Aquarius is beginning, Mary wrote using astrological language that would have been familiar to first-century mystics. When the patriarchal structures that have governed for 2,000 years begin to collapse under the weight of their own contradictions, when the earth herself cries out from the wounds inflicted by those who saw her as object rather than subject, when women begin to remember their power and men begin to remember their wholeness, then the time will come for the apocalypse of the beloved to be revealed, for the true meaning of the symbols to be decoded, for humanity to understand that the end times are not about escaping the earth, but about healing it, not about being rescued from matter, but about consecrating matter, not about the triumph of spirit over flesh, but about the sacred marriage of spirit and flesh. Mary described signs that would mark the beginning of this transition, and as Catherine read them, she felt chills running down her spine because the signs were manifesting now, in the early decades of the 21st century. Women will begin speaking truths that cannot be silenced. The secrets that have been kept will be revealed. Those who have been marginalized will move to the center. The earth will shake, and the waters will rise, and the fires will burn, not as punishment, but as the necessary dissolution that precedes transformation. And in the midst of chaos, there will be those who remember, who can read the signs, who understand that what appears as ending is actually beginning. And then Catherine knew she could not publish the manuscript through conventional academic channels without facing immediate excommunication and the destruction of her career. But she also knew she could not simply hide it again, not when the prophecy it contained seemed so directly relevant to the moment humanity was living through. She made high-resolution photographs of every page and encrypted them, distributing copies to trusted colleagues around the world with instructions that if anything happened to her, the files should be released publicly. And then she began teaching what Mary had taught, offering seminars that explored the Apocalypse Code, showing how the symbols that had been used to instill fear and promote submission could be decoded to reveal a message of empowerment and transformation. She explained that the whore of Babylon, who in the canonical revelation was portrayed as the ultimate evil, was in Mary's original vision actually the divine feminine herself, portrayed as whore by those who feared feminine sexuality and power, but actually representing the sacred priestess, the woman who channeled divine energy through her body without shame or suppression. Mary Magdalene herself was called whore, Catherine explained to her students, not because she was sexually promiscuous, but because she represented the feminine principle that patriarchy had to suppress, the knowledge that the body was sacred, that sexuality was a path to the divine, that women could be spiritual authorities without male mediation. By encoding herself as the whore of Babylon in her apocalypse, she was reclaiming the slur, transforming the insult into a symbol of power, showing that what patriarchy feared most was actually what humanity needed most, the return of the sacred feminine. Catherine's teachings spread through networks of women who had been searching for a Christianity that honored rather than suppressed the feminine, who had felt called to Mary Magdalene but had found only the sanitized version that the church allowed. The reformed prostitute who was saved by Jesus rather than the prophet and teacher who had received direct revelation and who had been Jesus's equal partner in the work of transformation. They gathered in circles and study groups, decoding the apocalypse together, recognizing in Mary's prophecy a description of what they were living through. the collapse of patriarchal structures, and the emergence of consciousness that could hold both masculine and feminine as sacred. In her final year, as illness began to consume her body, Catherine returned to the Vatican archives one last time, and she found something that confirmed what she had suspected. There was a letter from Constantine's advisors discussing which texts to include in the official canon, and it specifically mentioned the Apocalypse of Mary Magdalene, noting that while it contained powerful imagery that could be useful for maintaining control over believers, it needed to be corrected to remove the dangerous teaching about feminine authority and sacred partnership. The letter confirmed that John's revelation was indeed an adaptation of Mary's original vision, that the Church Fathers had known about Mary's text and had deliberately transformed it to serve their purposes. Catherine died knowing that the truth she had discovered would outlive her, that the copies she had distributed were already circulating, that women around the world were reading Mary's words and recognizing them as true, that the Apocalypse code was being cracked and the hidden prophecy was being revealed exactly as Mary had foreseen. The woman clothed with the sun was rising, the divine feminine was reclaiming her place, and the beast of patriarchal domination was being exposed for what it had always been. Not ultimate reality, but a temporary deviation. Not God's will, but human choice. Not permanent structure, but transitional phase. The manuscript remains in the Vatican archives, but it can no longer be suppressed because it lives now in the consciousness of those who have read it, who have decoded its symbols, who have recognized that the apocalypse was never about the end of the world, but about the end of a world, the world built on domination and separation, and the beginning of a new world built on partnership and sacred union. The world that Mary Magdalene saw in her vision 2,000 years ago, and that is finally beginning to manifest as the hidden prophecy emerges from the shadows where it was buried and takes its place in plain sight. No longer coded in symbols that obscure, but written in the hearts of all who are ready to receive it. The teaching that the divine is both masculine and feminine, that salvation comes not through escape from matter, but through consecration of matter, that the end times are the birth pangs of the new consciousness, and that Mary Magdalene was not the harlot, but the prophet, not the one who needed saving, but the one who brought the saving message, the apocalypse of the beloved that was hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when humanity would be ready to see what had always been there, the code that unlocks not just ancient text, but the future itself, the prophecy that the feminine would return and the sacred marriage would be restored, and the New Jerusalem would descend not from a distant heaven, but from the collective consciousness of all who choose partnership over domination, love over fear, the wholeness that comes when the split is finally healed and the divine feminine takes her rightful place, not as subordinate, but as equal, not as servant, but as partner, exactly as Mary Magdalene taught, and exactly as the true apocalypse has always proclaimed to those who had eyes to see and hearts to receive. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.